about who was Dred Scott. So who was Dred Scott, and how can we talk about, what can we learn about him, and what can we learn about his family, right? So let's talk about him today. Let's talk about Dred Scott, and hope you're doing well. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving or a good holiday meal and whatever you're doing. But I wanted to hopefully kind of come to you with some different things to share with you about Black history and stories about Black history that might be useful to you, things that might be helpful to you as we think about some cases that are famous in history, but we don't know a lot about the background behind them. We don't know a lot about the people who were part of these faces who made so much of this. So we're going to talk about Dred Scott today. And I'm sure you've heard of him. You may have heard of him. And you may have heard of him. Maybe you've heard of his wife. I know when I first listened to him and I first listened to stories about him or heard of things in school and things like that, I never heard anything about his family or his background. And we're going to go into some details right now as we talk about him. And I'm gonna go from this resource that I have here, which I'm gonna put on my website at blackeducation.org in the study center, about who was Dred Scott, because I like to try to include writing about it so that you can read this as well and look into yourself. But let's talk about him and who was he, and let's find out some things about him as we start to think about. And I'll just mention just real quick, I do have some resources and books that I have. So if you get a chance to support me, Stories About Black History is a book and a whole series that I've done, resources that I've done for some time. It's available on Amazon, and it's also available on my website at blackeducation.org. And I also have 10 things your child should know. If your child's in school, in elementary school, anywhere from pre-K to 5th grade, these resources, maybe even 6th grade, these resources may be helpful to you. So I ask that you check them out on my website and on Amazon. Thank you very much at blackeducation.org. I appreciate it. So let's talk about Dred Scott. Who was he? What can we find out about him? And as we think about Dred Scott, one of the things to think about is it's not just him. We're going to get into his family as well, because the famous case around Dred Scott is not just about him. It's about his family as well. So as we talk about this, I'll kind of jump into a couple of little things from a timeline. And there's a lot of resources that the federal government has, because this is one of the most famous cases in American history. So there's a lot of information that's out there, but let's talk about him. So Dred Scott was actually born around 1799 or 1800 to thereabouts. So he was born actually around about the same time that Sojourner Truth was born, if you want to kind of put a timeline in your mind, if you will. So he was born around the same time, give or take a year or two, a few years around Sojourner Truth when she was born. And he was born in Virginia. So he was owned by a man named Peter Blow. And Peter Blow, as I mentioned, lived in Virginia. And that's where Dred Scott was born. And he ended up moving to St. Louis, to Missouri. When he moved to Missouri, he brought Dred Scott with him, enslaved in Missouri. And obviously, Missouri is a slave territory in the 1830s when Dred Scott moved there. And it's also important to note, Dred Scott, by the time his case comes to the Supreme Court, he's been living for a while. He's close to 50-something years old, and he is 50-something years old when he actually gets to the Supreme Court. So he lives, unfortunately, a long time in slavery as he fights for his freedom. So his person who's enslaving him in Virginia brings him to St. Louis, into Missouri, and he ends up dying and having to sell him to someone else. And it ends up that Dred Scott becomes owned by a man named Dr. Emerson. So he's sold to a man named Dr. Emerson while he's in Missouri. And while he's in Missouri, this man named Dr. Emerson, he sold him in 1833. So he's in his 30s. He sold him in 1833. It's interesting to me because I never knew this about this. I never thought about this. But Dr. Emerson is a surgeon in the U.S. Army, and he's stationed at Jefferson Barracks there in Missouri. And so he's a surgeon in the U.S. Army, and I never thought about people being enslaved with the Army, being enslaved with the official military. I mean, obviously, it's been at universities. People were enslaved at universities. Sojourner Truth, when she was younger, her family was enslaved by a man who owned a hotel. There were all kinds of places, but the U.S. Army, and on U.S. Army property, there were people who were enslaved and bought there by their enslavers on U.S. Army property, and obviously it was something that was supported by the Constitution and by federal laws, as we'll see and talk about. So he is owned by a person who is a surgeon, a U.S. surgeon for the U.S. Army. And this man, Dr. Emerson, is moved. His whole unit is moved to Rock Island, Illinois. And in Rock Island, Illinois is not a slave territory. It's technically a free territory. And this becomes part of the crux of the Dred Scott case and the question that must be answered through the courts and with the Supreme Court. So when he's in Missouri, if you remember the Missouri Compromise that took place in 1820, it basically said that when you have this 36-degree, 30-minute line latitude in the United States, that anything above that, that was a part of basically the Louisiana Purchase, that the land that we got there, anything above that, slavery would not exist, with the exception of Missouri. So anything above this certain line, slavery will not exist, with the exception of Missouri, which is part of the compromise, and anything below that, slavery could exist. And so you kind of set up this north-south thing going on. Well, with respect to Dred Scott, it's the 1830s. His person who was enslaving him is with the U.S. Army, and he gets moved to Illinois, which is a free area, and he's moving into free territory now. And not only is he in Illinois, the person who's enslaving him later gets moved to Fort Snelling, which is west of the Mississippi River, still above that 36-degree latitude line that the Missouri Compromise said there would be no slavery. So he was technically also in free territory. And so he's there in free territory. He's in Fort Snelling. He is enslaved. And another thing happens that's important to his life. He meets his wife. There's another woman there. Her name is Harriet. She's also enslaved by another officer who's from Virginia, who happens to be at Fort Snelling. Harriet meets Dred Scott. They fall in love, and Dr. Emerson, who's enslaving Dred Scott, buys and purchases Harriet, and he allows them to get married. Under slave rules, if you will, he allows them to get married. So Harriet and Dred Scott get married, and so now you have a situation where he has a wife, and they're in free territory. They're on a military fort. They're on a military base, a military facility. And before they go back to Missouri, on their way back to Missouri, they have their first child. So you see up here in this picture, you can see two daughters. They have two daughters eventually, but their first child is born technically on free territory. So their owner, Dr. Emerson, he ends up getting stationed or moved down to Florida for some reason, and they end up going back to Missouri. And then when their owner meets him back up again, he comes back to Missouri, and he dies soon after he comes back. So there we have Harriet and Dred Scott, along with their first daughter, whose name I believe is Eliza, and they're in Missouri, and their owner who owned them, Dr. Emerson, is dead. Before he died, he got married a short time before he died to a woman named Irene Sanford. So she now inherits his will, inherits his estate, and the Scotts, Dred Scott and Harriet and their daughter, belong to her and to her child. The child that they had a young daughter that was going to be inheritor of the estate as well. So here we are passing people along as property for the benefit of this family and for the future of this family, because their daughter's really young. For the future of this family, where the Scotts have no future, no ability to pass on property. In fact, they are property. They have no ability to pass on anything as a future to their children. So they fight for it. And eventually, some years go by before they actually do court action. They have another child, and their second daughter is named Lizzie. So now they have two daughters. They have Eliza and they have Lizzie. And so we don't know why the Scotts made the decision they made. For some reason, they decided to petition for their freedom. And of course, we don't know what prompted them. They wanted to be free, so we know why they did it, but we don't know what prompted them to do that. Was it because they were trying to buy their own freedom, and Irene, the widow of their owner, wouldn't let them do it? Or were they going to be sold? Or was something going to happen? Did they want their children, maybe something was going to happen that prompted them to do what they did when they did it? But what they did was both Dred Scott and his wife Harriet went down to the courthouse. They went down to the courthouse in Missouri, and on April 6th, as you can see, on April 6, 1846, both Dred Scott and Harriet Scott filed separate petitions for their freedom. So when you hear the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, and we'll talk about why it's named that, it's not just Dred Scott, it's actually his wife. It's his wife too, and it's his children, because I believe in the wife's petition, she files on behalf of the daughters as well, because the daughters would fall under her condition if she was enslaved. So under her situation. So it's not just Dred Scott versus Sanford, it's Dred Scott and his wife and his children and his daughters versus this fighting for their freedom. And the interesting part about it, so why this becomes such a big case is, they go down there, and it's not unheard of, according to the laws and the courts in Missouri, to have them to rule in favor of enslaved people who had been in free territory and were considered free for a period of time, and they were brought back into enslaved territory. It was not uncommon, it was not unheard of for the court to say, you know what, you were free once, you're free forever. And that was kind of a term that they used, once free, forever free. But the state court in Missouri, they allowed the Scotts to bring their case. They allowed them to bring their case to court. But they initially ruled that, you know what, times are different now because the courts once said that once you're free, you should always be free. Well, that's not the same thing, and really you should be happy that you're in a civilized situation in a civilized country. You should be enslaved. That's literally basically what the court said initially. And so the Scots, they continued to pursue their case. They were able to appeal. They continued to pursue their case, and the case kind of went back and forth. It went on for some 11 years, back and forth in courts. In one situation, they were actually granted their freedom, but Irene Sanford appealed, and it ended up going to the Supreme Court. And the reason why I went to the Supreme Court is her brother, who lived in New York, was the executor of her husband's will, and he was basically an agent for her. And so that's why you end up having, and his last name was Sanford, and her last name, the widow's last name, her maiden name was Sanford. So that's why you end up having Dred Scott versus Sanford as the name of the case that people say. It's because her brother was the executor of her husband's will, and he lived in New York. So now you had a situation where the courts in Missouri ruled differently. One court said you're enslaved, another court said you should be free, another court said no, you should be enslaved again. They went back and forth, and then you had two parties, if you will, that were in different states. So the Supreme Court ended up hearing this case, and when the Supreme Court heard it, it's very interesting because the Supreme Court did not have to hear it the way it heard it. You probably you're probably familiar with Roger B. Taney and him being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. They didn't necessarily have to rule the way they ruled. They decided to take a much broader look at this, and they took this from the position that, Dred Scott and Harriet Scott were not people. They were property. They were not people under the rules of the Constitution, under the laws of the Constitution and the laws that were based off of the Constitution. They were not people. They were property. And so therefore they couldn't sue anyway. They had no right to sue. They shouldn't have been able to even bring a case to court because, a cow or a dog or any piece of property can't bring a case to court. And these people were not people. They were property under the Constitution. But they didn't just stop there. And I know a lot of times they want to make it just be Taney because it was Roger B. Taney, but the Supreme Court, this was the majority ruled in this favor. They didn't just stop there. They didn't just say that Dred Scott and Harriet, because they were enslaved, were not property. That's not what they said. They said this, and this is a quote from it. You can look up. I encourage you to look it up. It says, they said this: a free Negro, so any free Negro of the African race whose ancestors were brought to this country, sold as slaves, is not a citizen within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States. So I'll say it again, a free Negro. So even if you are formerly enslaved and you're now free and you're in America, if you're a free Negro of the African race whose ancestors were brought to this country and sold as slaves, is not a citizen within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States. So they didn't just rule against Dred Scott and against his wife and against his children. It was against any black person in America whose ancestors had been sold into slavery or were enslaved at any point in time. And of course, anybody who was currently in slavery. So this is why this decision was so far reaching. This is why it shook so many people, because you were now an African American and you could have been free for, years. You could have been like Benjamin Banneker. Benjamin Banneker was never enslaved. He was born in America. He was an American citizen. Technically, he was never enslaved. He was living in Maryland, but his family, his father was enslaved, and so that would have made him, even though he never in his life was bought and sold, that would have made him not be a citizen in the United States under the laws of the Constitution and how the Supreme Court interpreted this. Now, obviously, Benjamin Banneker was passed away by this time, but that's just making that point. Even if you were free, if anybody in your family, your ancestors had been bought and sold into slavery, you were not a citizen of the United States. You basically had no rights that they had to respect because you were not a part of what we the people, that the Constitution did not mean we the people for you. That's essentially what Roger B. Taney and the Supreme Court said. So that was something that shook up African Americans and people, period. If you were against slavery, if you were hating slavery, you were really hating the system now, because not only were enslaved people going to be property forever, but also free people who were black and whose families had been enslaved were now going to never be citizens. And that's essentially what the Supreme Court said. But it also said it went farther than that. It didn't just stop there. It went farther than that, and it said because they're property, we have to look at this from a property standpoint, because the Constitution allows those people who are citizens, who are part of we the people, to take their property wherever they want to take their property. So when you say, it basically said that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. When you say that there can't be slavery above this 36-degree latitude line in the United States, there can't be slavery here, but there can be slavery down there, they say, well, that's against the Constitution. You cannot tell a citizen, they were basically talking about Caucasian people, you cannot tell a citizen of the United States that they can't take their property anywhere within the United States, in any territory, whether it's a territory yet or a state. You can't tell them that. And so the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. That's also what it ruled. So that set things aflame, if you will. It's basically saying, it didn't matter what you said. And if Dred Scott's owner wanted to take him to Illinois or take him to another territory or a federal barracks, he can take him wherever he wants. And the federal government can't tell you where to take your cow or your property. And that's essentially what fired up people so much about this. But as I think about this, and I think about Dred Scott, and I think about his wife, Harriet, I think about how courageous they had to be to go down there that day in 1846 and to file those petitions. What that was like for them, because apparently they had no money. They didn't have a cent. There were people who came and eventually helped them. They didn't have any money. They had 2 children, but they knew they had to fight. They didn't have they didn't have the law necessarily on their side. They didn't have a whole lot of support. And the authorities were against them. But they, with what type of courageousness they went down there, and what did it take for them to go down there and to file their petitions, to submit for their own freedom, to fight for their own freedom in court. Now, obviously, the ultimate decision from the Supreme Court was a bad decision, and was a decision that rocked people and left them in a situation where they did not win their freedoms in court. They eventually were freed by the people who owned them later on, and Dred Scott died a short time after that. He died in 1858. But they were eventually freed. But the result of the condition and the result of the case was not what they wanted, but the case was so horribly decided. It made so many people just jump up against slavery. It made people understand that not only did slavery had to end, and that happened as a result of the Civil War and some other gradual laws that were taking place, but not only did slavery have to end, but the Constitution had to be changed. It wasn't, you just could not end slavery. You literally had to change the Constitution, because when you think about the laws we're talking about, these were ingrained in the Constitution. The Supreme Court case was based on the Constitution. The Fugitive Slave Act was based on the Constitution. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and 1850, the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas and Nebraska Act, all these things were based off of the Constitution and the willingness of people to have slavery. So eventually, when you see people end up having like the 13th and the 14th Amendment and things of that nature, I've heard people say, why do we need these things? Were these just radical things? Do we really need a constitutional amendment to end slavery? Well, yeah, you did. and because of the ruling of the Supreme Court, that kind of said that you did. So I want to thank, and I want to give honor, and I want to remember Dred Scott and his wife Harriet for doing what they did, because maybe had they not done what they did, we never would have the changes legally that we need to have based on what the result was of their case. So I just want to thank you for listening. God bless you. If you have any questions or comments, please put it down below. I'm going to try to do more of these things, but I want to thank you so much for listening. God bless you. Have a good one. Take care.